let's review my example solution for day 1's assignment. First up, we need to require in the chalk library to help us with colouring our output. Then we construct an array of the 3 names of colours that we want to use. And then finally, we iterate this array and call console.log using the chalk library, then the colour that we're using in this iteration, and then the hello world string. Here we can see our output in 3 different colours. Hi, and welcome to section 2, Hello Node. In this section, we'll get familiar with anonymous arrow functions, getting user input, validating user input, and displaying inputs back to the screen. From functions to arrow functions. In this video, we're going to cover arrow functions, which are a new feature in ES6. We'll talk about what an arrow function is, some examples of arrow functions, a discussion around binding the this keyword, and cover where arrow functions are best used. Arrow functions were introduced in ES6 to give a new way to write anonymous functions in JavaScript. Let's take a quick look. No longer do you need to write your functions like this. Instead, you could now write them like this. And you might wonder why you'd want to do this. There are a few cases, and we'll go over what these are. It's possible to define arrow functions in a number of ways. An arrow function that takes a single parameter could look like this. But with an arrow function, the curly braces aren't needed if a single expression is present, so you can leave them off, along with the return statement in this case. And this function would work just as well. If your arrow function takes more than one parameter, or if it takes 0 parameters, you'll have to specify the parentheses, like this. And then, if our function returns an object literal, we need to wrap that object literal in parentheses so that the interpreter doesn't get confused between our object and a new block scope. Now, arrow functions are commonly used as the iterated function with a lot of JS's array functions, map for example. So the ES5 method of fetching all these ages, for example, would have looked something like this. Or alternatively, the new ES6 way with arrow functions would be like this. And you get the same result. As we know, this keyword can be a little tricky in JavaScript. Arrow functions help us here by removing some of the ambiguity over how the keyword is assigned, meaning we can do away with closure assignments like that equal this, or manually rebinding our function definitions with the bind command. So from the MDN documentation, we can take their person class example. Now when this runs, the problem that you'll have is inside this function here, the reference to this does not point to the person, it points to the window. The classic solution to this problem would be to reassign this keyword to something else in this scope, something like this. And that would be effective. But it does mean that every time you come across the that keyword, in this case, you have to really know that this reassignment has happened. Otherwise you'll be confused as to what this variable is. So using arrow functions, we can fix some of this. And now this will work properly. There's an implicit bind happening of the this keyword to be the scope where the function was defined. Now, arrow functions are not a cure-all, and you can't use them in every situation. An easy rule of thumb is use functions in the global scope and for object prototype properties, use class for object constructors, and use arrow functions everywhere else. Bear in mind that your arrow functions are anonymous, which means that if you're looking through them in a stack trace, they're not going to be named. Whereas if you had a function that you've written out manually, this name of the function will appear in the stack trace, which can make things much simpler to track down. So just give some thought to that. While you can make use of a lot of the shorthands that arrow functions offer, like removing your parentheses and curly braces in certain circumstances, It's always worth asking the question as to whether those shorthands are worth the mental cost of remembering how they work when you look at your code again at a later date, or when someone else has to maintain what you leave behind.